Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, at this academic session in which I will soon hand over the floor to Professor Olivier Marie for his inaugural lecture as our new Chair of Applied Labor Economics. I'm very happy you all came today on this very warm day. It is, I think, one of the hottest days of this year. And also the professors were complaining about these gowns because they're really quite warm as well. But we have to keep them on. That's part of the tradition. I'm very sorry. We are very strict in our traditions. I just explained to you. We're actually not so much. But with this, we keep it on. So my name is Rianne Letschert, and I'm Director Magnificus of the university. And I always have the honor to chair these events. And that always gives me the opportunity to share with you a few words about our brand new professor. And I have a certain method for that because I have spies in the faculty. Because, of course, I don't know all professors as well as I would like to. So I need my spies to gather as much information as I can to get both a description on the academic work, but also about character. And that always gives very interesting details. So just relax, and I hope... And I hope you will also enjoy it. There are also some difficult parts for me to read. You will find out at the end. Now, your passion is criminality, one of your colleagues has told me. So when I read it, I thought, like, okay, that's interesting. Now, it would be very easy to take that the wrong way, but fortunately, those who know Olivier know better. That being said, his chair is not called Applied Crime Economics. Labor economics tops the list of his academic interest, followed by the economics of crime and economics of education. And this is by no means a random selection of topics. They are closely related, as is apparent from his research. Research that, to dive right into an important part of his work, is invariably thorough and rigorous. Olivier will not submit a journal article until he is sure it is the very best it can be. After all, he has seen all too often how it shouldn't be done. Having received his PhD in 2009 from Royal Holloway University of London, entitled Essays on the Economics of Crime, he once said, and I'm quoting him, "Up to the 1990s, lots of crime research was done semi-badly. The distinction between correlation and causation was not always made, and I'm from one of the first generations of economics PhDs that was taught to do crime research very seriously." End of quote. And this is indeed the key feature of his work. He can explore a data set endlessly, with remarkable dedication and perseverance, drawing on his extensive knowledge of empirical testing. In fact, it was the enormous amount of available data that brought him to the Netherlands almost 10 years ago. With these data sets, we can beat the Scandinavian countries, he once told the selection committee for a VENI research grant. Because until then, the Scandinavians had always had the best data for crime research. And Olivier wanted to do something about that. And our new dean, coming from the Scandinavian countries, will probably support that. Very good. Needless to say, he got the grant. He spent those years investigating the complex relationship between labor market opportunities and criminal activity, and whether effect sizes vary across different personality types and circumstances. Now, another achievement I would like to mention here is his impressive publication record in top journals. For example, in March last year, he published a paper in the Journal of Political Economy focusing on the fall of the Berlin Wall and the temporary collapse of fertility in East Germany. He and Arnaud Chevalier found that children born during the transitional period of economic uncertainty performed worse on various dimensions of their schooling. It was a paper they worked on for years and which received a great deal of attention also in the media. Likewise, I also want to mention his study on cannabis use by students. In 2011, the city of Maastricht introduced a rule restricting access to coffee shops to nationals of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. This meant many foreign students were no longer welcome. Olivier examined the study performance of these students and found that they significantly improved, especially on more mathematical and numerical exams. The result, another top publication, and a shower of media attention again. And that's when it comes in handy, I was told, that Olivier is a very good talker, a presenter. You can hear him coming a mile away, and for some people that can be a bit overwhelming. But if you look beyond that, you can see that he's incredibly helpful. He also has a large network that he's more than happy to use to also help others. The Erasmus School of Economics in Rotterdam saw all this too and offered him a job in 2016, followed by a professorship last year. Hold on a second, thought Maastricht University, specifically the Research Center for Education and the Labor Market. Not so easy, we're going to leave this man. Fortunately, they managed to keep him on for part-time, and so he spent the last few years traveling back and forth between Rotterdam and his home in Maastricht. And we're very happy also that you enjoy traveling, otherwise that would become problematic. As one of his colleagues said, and I quote, Olivier doesn't collect stamps, but experiences, preferably with friends and family. I am certain that the trip to Japan you'll be taking soon with your wife Sandra and son Hugo will be a wonderful addition to your collection of experiences. So I would also therefore like to conclude with a Japanese saying, and I have a wonderful speech writer, and every week she tries to add in words or sentences that I cannot pronounce. It's really true, and she tries it, it's like a challenge. So now I'm going to try to speak Japanese to you. It's like this. Naku neko wa netsumio toranu. You know what it means? Okay. It means a loud cat doesn't catch mice. Olivier, you are the living proof that the opposite is true. Good speechwriter, eh? Congratulations on your 2 chairs. We're very happy that you also chose to stay professor here in Maastricht. And on behalf of the executive board and the faculty board, we wish you all the best for your future. And the floor is now yours. And you can still have all your time, eh? Okay.
Thank you. Madame the Rector Magnificus, dear colleagues, dear friends, chère famille, cara familia. Thank you all for being here, and welcome to my inaugural lecture, or oratie in Dutch, which will definitely be in English, otherwise none of you will ever understand what I'm saying. So I will spend the next 45 minutes to talk about, to take you on a short journey into a very particular research field which I've been working on in the past 10 years. And that the field is called the economics of crime. So what does it mean? By the end of this talk, my ideal situation would be that I've convinced you that this relatively young field has already made some important scientific and policy contributions to our understanding of behavior and crime control. This would be ideal. But what I would at least hope is to never have the following conversation. What do? I'm an economist. Oh, so where should I invest my money? No. I do economics of crime. Oh, so you're a criminologist. So, oh no, I'm not a criminologist. Ah, got it. You work on crimes committed by banks, companies, etc. No. Mostly individual crimes, studying incentives that matter most. Huh? You lost me there. Is it something to do with gangs and the mafia? That sounds cool. Yeah, that's it. Okay, that's it. It's usually the conversation I end up having a lot. But more seriously, before we dive into the subject matter, let me quickly explain the title of my lecture, because some non-aficionados were a bit puzzled to what it meant. So in economics, the Homo economicus, or economic man, is an expression that pertains that individuals always make decisions rationally after making a mini cost-benefit analysis about this decision. The Homo Econo-Delictus I am proposing in this lecture, note the question mark, we're still not certain about this, is can we say already that individuals use the same tools to make crime participation decisions? If this is true or not can be tested looking at how changes in certain incentives may rationally affect how often people commit crime. So if you change certain incentives, do people commit more or less crime? This is what I've mostly worked on in the past decade, and I will go through some examples, concrete examples, although our Rector Magnificus has stolen some of my examples, but I will try to make them a bit longer. And especially the problems and the solutions that we try to find. Why? Because establishing causal and not just correlational link between certain incentives and crime is not as easy as it looks sometimes, okay? That is actually a good thing for me, otherwise I'd be out of a job if it was super easy, so I'm quite happy about that. But first, let's start 50 years ago. So I'm very happy to be giving this lecture exactly now in the spring in 2018, because 5 decades ago exactly, economics of crime was born. So while a number of French students were starting an unsuccessful revolution, including 2 people in the front row there, on the other side of the Atlantic, a young economist named Gary Becker was busy revolutionizing how economists theoretically view and do research into criminal behavior. I want you to note in the picture on the left that there is a sign about parking of professors. So where should professors park? And this is from the student movements in Nanterre, where I actually started the economics of crime 20 years ago. I did economics, not crime yet. And note the sign about parking because it will become extremely relevant to how Gary Becker come to the idea of the economics of crime in a minute. But before we get to what happened in the spring of '68, theoretically and model-wise, I want to take a short historical journey about some key people who've influenced a lot our thinking about crime, and also try to understand why it took us so long to get to a real economics of crime or a rational crime model until the mid-20th century, or the late mid-20th century. Oops, sorry. First, usually we say that all economic roads lead to Adam Smith, the father of modern economics. Well, not this one. So I've looked deep and deep into The Wealth of Nations, his famous book where he develops the invisible hand and the fact that markets are better at deciding what we should do. But he only mentions crime a couple of times, and mostly to say, okay, government should do nothing, but should try maybe to punish crime at least, and to control it. How? He doesn't go into that at all. So then I want to bring you to someone who's much more important in that respect, and it's the utilitarian approach of Jeremy Bentham, which was very influential on multiple areas of law and economics. He also marked me quite personally, as I regularly passed in front of his mummified remains, which you see here, at my time at UCL, when I started my PhD in economics about 15 years ago. A few nightmares about this, actually, because if you see his head at the bottom, it's actually what you see at the entrance of UCL. So he was the first one to make some important points about the fact that every human act should be first evaluated in terms if it will cause pleasure or pain. That's why I call him, Jeremy, pain versus pleasure, Bentham. And he does mention that to deter crime, the amount of pain derived from the forbidden act should be greater than the amount of pleasure. The cost-benefit analysis is already there, kind of, okay? But I think he's also extremely interesting, because if some of you didn't know, he was the one who designed the idea of, he started the design of optimal crime control, and this is actually one of his own designs of a Panopticon. So pan means inmate, and opticon is observe. And the Panopticon is to observe all inmates at once. And this was really the model for 19th century prisons. And you can see a lot of them in Arnhem, in Dublin, and in loads of places, and they're extremely beautiful. All the Batman movies have been filmed in there. So this is quite a reference. Then I want to talk about an often forgotten man, which came a few years later, and we're moving to the 19th century properly. And it's Adolphe Quetelet. He was a Belgian statistician and social scientist. Has he not been forgotten, mostly forgotten because he was Belgian? Probably yes, okay? Otherwise, it would make the game of naming 10 famous Belgians too easy. So we forget about Quetelet a lot. So Quetelet tried throughout his life to apply the rigorous and repeated statistical observations, which had advanced physics so much, to all sorts of behaviors in society, or what he called himself social physics. So I think that's extremely interesting to go to social physics. Most of you might know him or even hate him because he's the one who invented the BMI, the body mass index. So if you're not happy with your BMI, blame Quetelet. He was also the first to base observation on criminal behavior on actual statistical data. So he went to Paris courts for 8 years and collected all he could, and he wrote Sur l'homme et le développement de ses facultés, where he already noted some very interesting trends in at the age at which you commit different types of crime. And this is the famous age crime curve, which people have repeated ever since. Okay? And also, it also even mentioned the fact that people with less education seem to be more prone to committing crime, so getting already to the idea of education in crime, which I will be talking about later. So this seems to indicate that we're almost there with developing an idea of incentives matter for criminal behavior. So we're in 1835 and we're almost there, and we still have to wait a lot. So what happened? It took almost a century, more than a century to get there. Well, Lombroso happened, I would like to say. And this was terrible for our science. So Cesare, born criminal Lombroso, often referred to as the father of criminology, and now criminologists are trying to get this name away because it's not that great. He put forward pseudo-scientific research into the causes that brought back our fields for decades. During decades, we were stuck in the Lombroso ideas. His theory essentially stated that criminality was inherited and that someone born criminal would be identified by physical congenital defects. So for an example of his most famous study, in L'Uomo Delinquente, he looks at the facial and cranial features of Italian inmates, which you can see there, and use these to propose certain rules on face type, the size of your nose, the size of your mouth, your size of your eyes relative to all that, the proportions, that should be used to predict if a person will become a criminal. i.e., he called this criminal anthropology. He even went as far as saying that left-handedness, so using your left hand, was a very predictive sign of crime. So 20% of criminals, he noted, were left-handed, while 5% of the normal population were. Well, growing up with a left-handed sister, I will only say it makes you criminally bad at throwing things. Seriously. This was quite a catastrophe for crime research, as it took years and massive effort to get out of the idea that people were not just born criminals, but that most criminal participation decisions were made rationally, and that we could do something to try and influence participation. That's what's important. If you think you're born like this, you can't do anything. But if you think there are incentives, you can change those incentives. So now I'm coming back a little bit after my historical tour to Gary Becker, who in 1968 published in the journal Political Economy his seminal paper, Crime and Punishment and Economic Approach, where he really put down the model for the economics of crime and attitudes. Okay? So Becker was the first to apply economic modeling to understand a lot of human behavior, which may at first not look rational. He started with discrimination, marriage, children, crime, and he got the Nobel Prize for that in 1992 for having extended the domain of microeconomic analysis to a wide range of human behavior and interactions, including non-market behavior. So that's where I'm also working. So I will let him speak himself, and here he is, if I can get the mouse somewhere, yes. Here he is, himself explaining the economics of crime, and we are coming back to the parking incidents. So this is in 2001, he explains, on the way to a PhD defense in Colombia. He will tell you how he came up with the idea of the economics of crime when he had to decide to park. Oh, let me try to make this work.
I was rushing down to Columbia, driving down, to give an oral exam to a PhD student. I had to park, and I had to decide whether to park illegally on the street around the Columbia neighborhood or put it in a parking lot, which was further away, and of course cost some money. And I said, well, what's the chance I'll get a ticket? And I made a calculation in my head, and I left it on the street. And as I walked over to the exam, I said, but if I'm going through that calculation, then the police must also be deciding how often they should inspect in order to determine what's the right thing for them to do, which is costly. So I asked the poor student to solve that problem when I came in, and he, or she, I don't remember if it was a man or a woman, she couldn't do it, not naturally, but I was looking more at the thought processes, not whether they could do it, and they did fine. And I kept thinking about it, that this was a good problem. Because if we take the approach I used, that people decide on crime with similar sort of calculations as they decide on whether to become a professor, that's the starting point. There's no difference between criminals and professors in that sense. Of course, some people are honest, they don't want to be criminals, but the kind of calculation, can I do better by this as opposed to something else, is a calculation I think a lot of criminals make. And then we have to have enforcement. How much money do we want to put into enforcement, to capturing and convicting and punishing people? If we improve legal opportunities through education, my human capital work came in, that should reduce crime. So I built a framework to discuss those issues, where improving education will reduce crime, improving the likelihood we will apprehend and convict criminals would reduce crime. And then I went back and looked how criminals would respond to this and came to a bunch of conclusions about how much we should put into one activity, another activity. I did some preliminary tests on this with actual data, whether criminals actually respond to punishment, where improvements in education reduce crime. I had a series of students who followed that up. So this is the way the area developed. It's now a very big area in economics, some very good work being done. Some by my students, some by a lot of other people. But my orientation...
Oh, sorry. His orientation was that it was true. Sorry. So now I will show you the model itself. Do not panic for anyone who hates math. I will give you a very slow run-through of the model. And first, you make a crime decision, crime yes or no, which is based on a number of incentives or factors. And they are color-coded. What's the probability that I will be caught? How likely am I to be punished? That means if I park illegally, how often do the guys pass to check my car? Have they got a new technology, for example? What's the severity of the punishment? So how strong is my punishment if I get caught? And in that case, for example, for the parking situation, in Paris, it used to be 16 euros, but for 3 months, it's been 100 euros. And I can tell you, people have changed their behavior a lot. This is not even tested properly, but I know some people. Wages from illegal activity. So this is maybe the least studied of them all, and I put it in gray because I don't really have a proper paper on that yet. But this is the wages from illegal activity, and when I talk about the wages, it's also the pleasure or the utility you get from it. Okay, so for example, if you park illegally, if you win 5-10 minutes to get quickly to the PhD defense, that makes you happy and that's a utility, okay? Or if you like to hit someone, that can be the utility. There's no wages, but we can include loads of things in this model. And finally, we have the wages from legal activity. So anything you do, the fact that you get more education is likely to reduce your probability to commit crime because you increase your wages, okay? But I'll come to them one by one now by testing them. So in the parking case, for example, the extreme case would be I need my car to drive and for my job, then it would be an extremely high cost to be caught, okay? Now, let's show, I'm going to go through some papers where I tested the impact of each of these incentives. So I'm going to start with the P incentive, the probability of being caught. So the question I will ask is, does more police reduce crime? It sounds kind of obvious, so if I put you more police, more or less police, and more or less crime, what would you expect? Well, if you do a simple regression on that, you find that more police leads to more crime. And so for many years, there was a massive problem that a lot of even research was concluding, more police, more crime. And people were like, okay, so we got to reduce police. But as you can imagine, these are areas in the UK, and that's the number of police. And yes, you have more police, more crime. But when there's more crime, we put more police. So this is a case, a problematic case called reverse causality. It's not because there is more police that there's more crime, it's because there is more crime that there's more police. So we have to try to solve those kinds of problems. Okay? So I'm going to talk about some work I did with Stephen Machen back in the UK, who was my mentor during my PhD. And can extra police resources reduce crime? So when I started my PhD in 2005, and we were told by the Home Office at the time, there is an epidemic, a big problem with street crime. And you can see two titles tabloids in the UK who were really pushing it and saying we have to do something about street crime. So the solution of the Home Office was to increase the number of police, but only in certain areas of the UK. So they only put more police in the red areas and no more police in the white areas. So it sounds already pretty simple. We can compare the red and the white, but of course they're quite different. So we might be worried. It's still not enough to solve the reverse causality problems. So what we do and what we need to do is to check that the rate of crime in those areas has been moving at the same rate up to the time of the policy. Even if the levels of crime are different, it's not so problematic. What we want is that the rate of crime, how much crime has increased, is the same. And I think this is a very convincing picture of a paper. I like to sum up my papers in one picture. And in that case, you can see that, yes, street crime had been exploding up to 2002 when they started the policy. And as you can see, it led to a minus 30%. So the dotted line is with extra police, without extra police, and the dark line is with extra police. And clearly, there was a big effect of the police. So that's the first evidence. So it seems that police does reduce crime. That's the first one. A second one I've worked quite a lot on with various people is how do the wages from illegal activity matter for crime decision making? And here I'm going to focus especially on education because it's the decision prior to wages in a way. So we can make the direct link quite quickly there. And so I want you to take boy H, for example, and compare him to boy O. And boy H and boy O are a little bit different because boy H has high level of education and we see no arrest for him. Boy O has low levels of education, but some arrests. So, if we compare the two boys very simply, we can conclude more education reduces crime. So that's solved. That's it. This time we have no reverse causality problems. It goes in the same direction. We're very happy. Wrong. Other factors that can drive both decisions into education and crime might be hugely important, and we're forgetting about them. Okay, and let me give you the example of patience, which you might be born with or get very young before you go to education. And maybe boy H has high patience, and so he both chooses high education and no arrests, but there's no direct link between the level of education and arrests. While boy O has very low patience, cannot wait for things, so doesn't wait at school, and also commits crime because he cannot wait to get some gains from crime. Okay, he wants the new shoes now. So how do we solve this problem? That's a bigger problem. So now, this is also work with Stephen Machin and Sun Chicha, who should be in the room, I hope, yes. And so how do we solve such a problem? Well, we need to find a change in education level that does not result from an individual choice to get more or less education. And in that case, what we exploited in an EJ paper was a 1972 law in the UK that changed the minimum age from 15 to 16 years old. And what you can see, it's very simple. You see the babies born between 1950 and 1965, and the average years at which those people left education, which you can clearly see jumped enormously in 1972 when those guys turned 15, because they had to stay at school. Okay? The big assumption we need here for this to work is that the babies born just before and just after are the same. And in my picture, they are. But in reality, you can test if, I do not think that parents make a decision along 16, 17 years before a child is born about that. And so what do we find? We look at this, and of course what we do look is how those cohorts compare in terms of crime on the other side. And what we can clearly see, so you have the number of arrests, the rate of arrest on the left-hand side, is that there was a big jump. So I artificially put what it would have been without the education having changed in 1957 exactly. And that's quite a substantial, significant jump. And what this means is that if you increase education by 10%, or I mean just the years of education people take, so that's not very much, you reduce crime by 2.5%. That's a very strong effect. And if you take this in the probability of getting any qualification as well, So that means getting a degree or the first level of degree, that's even stronger. So education is extremely effective in reducing crime. Now let's talk about the severity of punishment. And you might think I will talk about prisons or something else like that, but I'm going to take another route. And it's true, it's the same. If something is illegal or not, so if you're likely to be punished or not for using it, are you more or less likely to consume it? So, we're going to talk about cannabis, but you could think exactly the same for alcohol. And you have the idea that those products can be legal or illegal. But what happens to consumption when it's legal or illegal? And it sounds, like a simple thing to solve, but it hasn't been solved properly yet. Why? It sounds easy. You just compare before and after. So you can compare people who've just turned 18 to people who are not 18 and suddenly have access to alcohol in the Netherlands. Okay, have access to legal alcohol. Is it going to make a big change? Or, like some people are really trying to do in Colorado, the legalization of pot made a big difference. Does it? Does it make a big difference? It sounds like pretty easy. But it's mostly not possible because too much changes. So let me just quickly explain what I mean here. Is at 18, first of all, you have access to alcohol, but you also have access to a car, you have access to to pot as well, and loads of other things, which means it's really hard to disentangle which channel is working here, okay? And actually, there's some nice papers who showed that you see massive increases in consumption of alcohol at just 18, but if you take away the day of the birthday, there's no effect. Because it's people at 18 drink so much on their birthday, they're more likely to be arrested and everything. So I think that's a nice paper. And in Colorado, it's quite interesting because so many things change at the same time. So Colorado was prepared for that, and the big problem usually is the police doesn't like legalization. And the police will arrest people more when it's legalized. They will bother people more. They do not like legalization. So if police behavior changes, then we cannot compare before and after. So with some work with Ulf, who's in the room as well, I hope. No, okay, he told me he's late. So, ideally, we compare consumption of two groups over time. One would change in legal access, and one always has legal access. So we want to compare two groups like that. And I was very lucky that I arrived just before the Maastricht experiment. And basically, when I saw this plastered all over the coffee shops of Maastricht, I was extremely shocked, especially because I'm on the wrong side of the equation here. I'm a no, 9 no, to all the France, Luxembourg, and all other nationalities. They could not enter coffee shops during 6 months. While all the Dutch, Belgium, and Germans were allowed to enter the coffee shops. And I presented this a few times in the US, and they were like, really? This is completely racist. And I said, it's Maastricht, it's fine. So the problem, of course, is then we thought about it, and that's where we discussed this with Ulf a lot, is that we had no consumption data, or we weren't sure it was well reported. And you might not want to trust consumption data as well. Why? Because when something becomes legal, people are more likely to say, yes, I'm consuming it. A great example I like is when homosexuality was made legal in the UK, the number of people who announced that they were gay in the statistics increased by 40%. I am really uncertain the law made people change their sexuality, so I think it's more a reporting problem. So what can we do? We focus on the grade of students. Why? Because when you smoke, your brain goes on holiday. And we have studied this a lot in terms of the literature. And basically, if you're likely to smoke, you're really likely to have worse grades, and especially, as our rector said, in math and other such skills. What do we find in our paper? What do we find in our paper? This is comparing two groups of students. So at the time where everyone had access is the line where they are exactly the same. Okay? Again, this is very important to validate our method. They have exactly the same level of grades, or the same changes in grades, not in terms of levels. But then at the 6 month when some of our students could still smoke, so the Dutch, Belgium, and Germans, you can see there's a big difference in grade to the ones who could not enter the coffee shops. And that's an 11% change, which is huge at this, in such a short time. So this was quite an influence, as our rector said, with a lot of media attention, and I became the anti-pot guy around the world. I was like, no, I just have a small paper, let's talk about it. But last but not least, of the papers I want to talk about completely is going to be the idea that we can change. This is something maybe Becker didn't really talk about so much. We can change the F at the beginning. What is this little f? It's more, in math, it would be the functional form, but it's the perception that people have on each of those incentives, or how much weight you want to put on each of those. Okay? So maybe we can find some preferences, we will put them in economics, that change how much people put weight on all those things, on how they value all these incentives. Okay? So can we find cohorts where we have individuals with different perceptions completely? So what we know is that parents influence criminal decision by change in perception. This is what we want to test, in all incentives simultaneously. So we move from a different functional form in a way. And this comes from two big influential papers. So the first one is from Stephen Levitt, which a lot of you must know because he was one of the pioneers of applied economics of crime. And he still claims that the legalization of abortion is responsible for 50% of the drop in crime. Why? Because some children were not born, which were not wanted. So you have the new cohort of children who are more wanted and more cared for by their parents and committed less crime. And at the same time, I'm going to link this here to a paper by the person who hired me here when I arrived, Thomas Dorman, about risk attitude. So risk attitude is just to measure from 0 to 10, how likely are you to take risk in your life? And Thomas and co-authors, in a lot of very influential papers, have shown that answering this question, 0 to 10, very risky, not very risky, is more predictive than education, than what your parents were doing, and loads of other things like this. But they also showed in another paper that your parents transmit a lot of this risk. So conditional education, you can see a lot of this risk. So I will link those two papers. But to try to study this, I need a big fertility shock, increase or drop in birth, to study it. You already know what it is. The wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this is my work with Arnaud, which is here, I can see him, on the change in fertility and crime after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this is just in one graph to illustrate how big the drop was in Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So in dots you have West Germany not moving at all, and in dark you have East Germany, massive drop of 40 to 50% in number of births. Just after the fall of the wall, people were very worried. So what happened to those kids in terms of their criminality when they grew up? Those kids who were born in whose parents did not really react to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And what you can see here, and I like this picture because it speaks for itself, almost, is that this cohort, so again in dark you have the East German children, and that's the children born just after the fall of the wall, and they are 30% more likely to commit crime and be arrested. This is extremely strong. So this is a selectivity of parents issue, okay? It's a bit more complex than the previous paper, but I want to bring it down to one big mechanism at the back, I think, and that's the one about risk loving. So now we use the measures invented and created by Thomas Dorman and co-authors, and we see if those parents, the mothers and the kids around this period, were more or less likely to be risky. And so at the top you have the risk of the mothers. Do they love risk? And at the bottom you have, do the children love risk? What you can see is only at two cohorts, and the one who were born just after the fall of the wall, the children and the mother who had children just after the fall of the wall, are much more likely to be risky than compared similar kids in West Germany. So risk attitude seems to be driving this relationship, if we push it a little bit. Let me just tell you what's next for me now. I think I have enough time. It was a bit faster than I planned. I will my next proposal for at least the next 5 years is to propose a life cycle approach to crime prevention, to consider the whole life cycle or at which time you commit crime or not. So here I've plotted the actual probability of being arrested in the Netherlands using microdata. So the big Dutch data, the great quality of data, I'm trying to harness this quite a lot more nowadays. And what you can see is there might be 3 phases of crime. First, you commit no crime at all. And there, parents might matter a lot. So this is similar to my work on Germany, but I would like to do it with Dutch data. And I have identified in 1970 the legalization of the contraceptive pill that made teenage mother stop having kids almost by 45% from within 3 years. So the contraceptive pills seem to have changed a lot the number of children born by a certain group of women, and I'm going to look into that. The second is during periods. There's a time when crime explodes and a lot of people are committing crime. And I would like to think, how can we prevent crime after the first arrest by creating some simple models of why do you commit the first one, why do you commit the second one, why do you commit the third one, and what can we do about it? Okay? But I think also we should consider what happens in the after period. Once someone has been involved in crime for a while and they have to go into prison, we think that Dutch prisons are pretty great because they're not overcrowded. But what most people don't know is that it's because in 2004, there was a massive change from single-use cells to multiple-use cells. So before you had one person in a cell, and suddenly they said, we have too many people, let's put 2 people in each cell. And no one has properly studied this, and now we have access to the data to see the impact of being with another guy in a cell rather than being alone before. So it's a nice little experiment, which I think is perfect in that sense. And so I hope in the next 5 years that mixing the big Dutch data, the BDD, and experiments, we will increase much more our knowledge on incentives and crime. But my final words will be to thank a lot of people. So I have time. So. First, erg bedankt, and many thanks to Maastricht. Not only the university, but also the people of this extremely endearing city for having received and treated me so well since I arrived. I want to thank in particular the Rector Magnificus, our new Dean, welcome, and the Head of Economics for taking the time to be here today. I'm very happy to see almost the entire Roa family here together, including the 4 Musketeers, Andres, Didier, Frank, and Rolf. I will let them decide who is D'Artagnan. Who died here, for those who didn't know, just behind the university. It's also great to see so many colleagues from other departments and co-authors from all over the world. A good sign that you are in the right profession if you can make good friends while you work. To my good old friends who came from Brexit Blighty, à mes amis, ma sœur, mes 3 super-neveux, cousins et tantes venus de la lointaine France, merci beaucoup for making it to share this moment with me. Vous pensiez pas être là un jour, hein? I, of course, want to give a very special thanks to the 2 people who made any of this possible. Mes parents, merci de m'avoir donné tous les outils pour réussir dans cette vie et surtout d'avoir persévéré même quand la tâche paraissait désespérée. Last but not least, muito obrigado a todos os amigos brasileiros que são nossa família nessa cidade e que sempre estão lá para matar a saudade de meu segunda terra, o Nordeste. As últimas palavras estão reservadas para minha Sandra maravilhosa e meu Hugo tão querido. O amor que a gente se dá em casa e que faz de mim o homem mais feliz do mundo. Obrigada para tudo, o apoio e a paciência. Amo vocês. Ik heb gezegd. Ah, yes.
You can stay here, but well, no, there is still a tradition, as I told you at the beginning. This was your first mistake. You could do two, eh?
Ah, yes.
We talked when we met each other, like, how formal is the tradition? I said, very formal. But then I made a mistake, and then he said, I have two. So that's... Olivier, thank you so much for a fascinating inaugural address. I understand completely why your colleagues said that you are a wonderful presenter. I think I need to call my colleague in Rotterdam, who just starts actually half June, as a new rector. I'm gonna try to convince him to let you go, come back here full time. There's always competition between the two rectors, so I will do my best. I very much enjoyed it. I myself work in the field of victims of crime, so not the criminology, but the victimology. So I learned a lot from what you've been doing, and I hope that someday we can have a glass of nice Limburg wine to discuss more both of our fields. So thank you very much. This brings us now to the end of this inaugural address, and we will head now towards the reception area, which can be outside because it's such a beautiful weather, so we'll be in the courtyard. I also ask you just to go into that yard and not stand in the queue, because otherwise you'll be too long in the queue inside, and find your moment to congratulate our newly appointed professor. And that brings us to the end of this ceremony. We also have to be careful.